He carried the coffee pot with steady hands, moving between tables like he'd done it 1,000 times before. The uniform was simple: black slacks, white shirt, a small name tag that read Frank. His limp was barely noticeable, just a slight favor of his left leg that most customers never saw. But the teenagers at table 7 saw it. They saw it, and they laughed. "Look at the old guy," one of them whispered, loud enough for half the diner to hear. "But he's been carrying plates since the Stone Age." Another joined in, mimicking the slight hitch in his step. "At least he found something he's good at, right?" Frank didn't react. He just kept pouring coffee, kept clearing tables, kept doing his job with the same quiet dignity he'd carried for the past 37 years. What those kids didn't know, what nobody in Murphy's diner knew, was that the slight limp came from shrapnel, and the steady hands that never shook, even when the room got loud. Those hands had once pulled 3 men from a burning helicopter in Vietnam. And in exactly 42 minutes, when a group of Marines walked through that door, the entire restaurant was about to learn who Frank really was. Welcome to Untold Hidden Stories. Before we dive into this powerful story of respect, service, and recognition, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. These hero stories matter more than you know. Murphy's Diner had been serving the same coffee and home-style cooking for 43 years, sitting on the corner of Main and Cedar like a piece of Americana that time forgot. Red vinyl booths, checkered linoleum floors, and a jukebox that still played Patsy Cline for a quarter. The kind of place where truckers stopped for breakfast at 5 a.m. and high school kids came after football games to spend their allowance on milkshakes and fries. Frank Martinez had been working there for 6 years, ever since his wife Maria passed, and the house got too quiet to bear. He wasn't the fastest server, wasn't the chattiest with customers, but he was reliable. Showed up every day at 6 a.m. sharp, stayed until closing, never called in sick. The owner, a woman named Betty who'd inherited the place from her father, trusted him with the keys. Most of the regulars respected him. The construction workers who came in for coffee before dawn appreciated that he remembered how they liked it. Black for Tommy, 2 sugars for Mike, cream and sugar for the new kid, whose name Frank made sure to learn by his 3rd visit. The elderly couples who came for the early bird special knew he'd remember that Mrs. Patterson needed her toast light and Mr. Johnson couldn't have salt. But every now and then, especially on weekend nights, a different crowd would come in. Younger, louder, the kind who saw an older man limping between tables and thought it was entertainment. Tonight was one of those nights. It was just after 9 p.m. when they walked in. 5 teenagers, probably juniors or seniors from the local high school, full of energy and attitude that comes with thinking you know everything about the world. They took the corner booth, the one Frank always hoped would stay empty during his shift because it was the farthest from the kitchen, and his left leg always ached more by evening. They were loud from the start. Not necessarily mean, just thoughtless in the way that youth can be. They ordered burgers and fries, sodas all around, and immediately started treating the place like their personal comedy club. "This place is so retro," one of them said, a girl with bright pink highlights. Like, deliberately old school or accidentally stuck in time? Her boyfriend, a tall kid with a Letterman jacket, laughed. "Definitely accidentally. Look at this place. But they haven't changed the menu since my dad was in high school." Frank approached their table with the practiced patience of someone who'd served thousands of customers over the years. He pulled out his order pad. Yes, still paper, not some tablet or digital device, and smiled politely. "Good evening, folks. What can I get started for you tonight?" That's when they noticed the limp. It wasn't dramatic. Frank had learned to compensate over the years, to shift his weight in a way that minimized the visible hitch. But when you're walking across an uneven diner floor carrying a full coffee pot, sometimes the old injury makes itself known. The kid in the Letterman jacket nudged his girlfriend. "Dude, check it out," he whispered, not nearly as quietly as he thought. "Old guy's got a gimp leg." Frank pretended not to hear. He'd gotten good at that over the years. "So, what'll it be tonight?" They ordered 5 burgers, various preparations, sides of fries, onion rings for the table. Frank wrote it all down carefully, repeated it back to make sure he had it right. and headed toward the kitchen. Behind him, he heard the snickering start. "Think he heard it on the job?" one of them said. "Maybe dropped a tray on his foot?" "Nah, probably just old," another replied. "Everything stops working when you get that ancient." The girl with the pink hair joined in. "My mom says guys like that usually end up in jobs like this because they can't do anything else. Like, this is probably the best he could manage." Frank had heard worse. Much worse. During his 6 years at Murphy's, he'd been called slow, old, pathetic, a waste of space. He'd been told he should retire, that he was taking up a job some young person could do better. He'd been mocked for his clothes. The same 3 white shirts, rotated and washed with military precision. For his careful way of counting change. For the reading glasses he needed to see the order pad clearly. None of it was new, and all of it rolled off him like water off a duck's back. What these kids didn't know was that Frank Martinez had spent 26 years in the United States Marine Corps, that he'd served 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Lebanon and 1 in the Gulf War, that the limp they found so amusing came from the day his helicopter was shot down outside Da Nang in 1968, and he crawled back into the burning wreckage twice to pull out unconscious crew members. They didn't know about the Purple Heart in the cigar box on his bedroom dresser. They didn't know about the Bronze Star with V device for valor, or the Silver Star he'd never told anyone about, not even Maria. They didn't know that his steady job carrying plates came after a career where he'd carried wounded Marines to safety, where he'd carried a flag at ceremonies honoring fallen brothers, where he'd carried responsibility for the lives of young men who weren't much older than they were. But Frank wasn't the kind of man to tell them any of that. He'd learned long ago that true strength didn't need to announce itself. He delivered their food 20 minutes later, each plate placed carefully in front of the right person, extra napkins provided without being asked. "Anything else I can get you folks right now?" "Yeah," the Letterman jacket kid said, barely looking up from his phone. "Maybe try not to drop anything on the way back to the kitchen." "Okay, Grandpa." His friends erupted in laughter. One of them actually mimicked Frank's slight limp as he walked away, exaggerated into a comical hobble that bore no resemblance to the real thing. Frank just nodded politely and returned to his other tables. But across the diner, in a booth near the window, someone else had been watching. Someone who'd noticed the careful way Frank moved, the precise military bearing that 6 years of civilian service hadn't quite erased. Someone who'd seen the faint tan lines on his wrist where a watch had sat for decades, and the way he unconsciously stood at parade rest while taking orders. Jimmy Chin had been having dinner with his girlfriend when the teenagers started their commentary. Jimmy was 24, 2 years out of Marine Corps service himself, working as a mechanic while he finished his degree on the GI Bill. He'd been planning to have a quiet dinner, maybe catch a movie afterward, but the mockery at table 7 had his attention. There was something about the older waiter that reminded Jimmy of the staff sergeants who trained him. Something in the posture, the way he handled disrespect with quiet dignity, the methodical way he approached his work. Jimmy couldn't put his finger on it, but every instinct he developed in 4 years of military service was telling him that Frank wasn't just some old guy who'd ended up waiting tables. When Frank came by to refill his coffee, Jimmy looked up and caught his eye. "Thank you, sir," he said, with the kind of respect that goes beyond normal customer courtesy. Frank paused for just a second, met Jimmy's gaze, and nodded once. It was a small interaction, but Jimmy caught something in that look. Recognition. Maybe understanding. 20 minutes later, Jimmy's phone buzzed with a text from his buddy Rodriguez, another former Marine who lived across town. "Yo, dinner at Murphy's Diner with some guys from a VFW. You interested?" Jimmy glanced at his girlfriend, then at the teenagers who were still making jokes about Frank's limp. "Actually, yeah," he typed back. "I'm already here. How many of you coming?" "6 of us. Be there in 15. Jimmy smiled and put his phone away. He had a feeling the evening was about to get very interesting. At 9:47 p.m., the door to Murphy's Diner opened and 6 men walked in. They weren't particularly large or imposing individually, but together they carried something that made every conversation in the restaurant pause for just a moment. It was in the way they moved, coordinated but not showy, alert but relaxed. It was in their posture, their bearing, the way they automatically scanned the room as they entered. Jimmy stood up and waved them over, but Rodriguez held up a hand. He'd spotted Frank at the coffee station, and something about the older man's profile had caught his attention. "Holy shit," Rodriguez whispered, loud enough for his companions to hear, but not the rest of the restaurant. "Is that—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Every one of the 6 Marines was staring at Frank now, seeing what Jimmy had seen, the bearing, the precision, the unmistakable signs of a man who'd served. But it was Tommy Kowalski, a grizzled veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, who recognized more than just military bearing. Tommy had spent his first deployment under a staff sergeant who'd become a legend in their unit, a Vietnam vet who'd extended his service through multiple conflicts, who'd trained hundreds of Marines, who'd saved more lives than anyone could count. "Martinez," Tommy breathed. "Staff Sergeant Frank Martinez." The name rippled through the group like electricity. Every Marine learns the stories, the legends passed down from generation to generation. Staff Sergeant Martinez was one of those stories. The helicopter rescue outside Da Nang, the defensive action in Beirut, the night patrol in Kuwait, where he'd single-handedly held off an enemy squad while his unit evacuated wounded. Rodriguez stepped forward first, with the others close behind. They approached the coffee station where Frank was refilling the pot, moving as a unit with the kind of quiet precision that comes from years of shared training and mutual respect. Frank looked up as they approached, and for a moment, his carefully maintained civilian composure flickered. He recognized them immediately, not individually, but collectively. The way they moved, the way they carried themselves, the look in their eyes that he'd seen in mirrors for decades. "Staff Sergeant Martinez?" Rodriguez said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of recognition and respect. Frank set down the coffee pot carefully, his expression unreadable. "That was a long time ago, son." "Not that long ago, sir." Tommy Kowalski stepped forward. "Tommy Kowalski, 2nd Battalion's 7th Marines. I served under Gunny Williams in Ramadi. He told us stories about you, sir. About Da Nang." A silence fell over the group, and slowly, the rest of the diner began to take notice. Conversations quieted, heads turned, and gradually everyone in Murphy's became aware that something significant was happening near the coffee station. Frank looked at the 6 Marines standing before him. Young men who could have been his sons, who'd fought their own wars, carried their own scars. And for the first time in 6 years, his civilian mask slipped completely. "You boys did your own fighting," he said simply. "Iraq, Afghanistan?" "Yes, sir," came the unified response. "Then you know," Frank said, and they did. They knew about the brotherhood that transcends time and conflict, about the bonds forged in places where life and death decisions are made by teenagers, about the way a uniform changes you forever, even after you take it off. At table 7, the teenagers had stopped laughing. Rodriguez turned to address the restaurant, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet space. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I'd like you to meet Staff Sergeant Frank Martinez, United States Marine Corps. 3 tours in Vietnam, decorated veteran, and one of the finest Marines who ever wore the uniform." The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of interrupted conversation, but the weighted stillness of recognition, of understanding that they were in the presence of something larger than themselves. One by one, other customers began to stand. The construction workers who'd always appreciated Frank's quiet service. The elderly couples who knew he remembered their preferences. Betty, the owner, emerged from behind the counter with tears in her eyes. But it was a teenager in a Letterman jacket who broke the silence, his voice smaller and younger than it had been all evening. "Sir," he said, standing up at table 7, his friends following his lead. We're sorry. We didn't know." Frank looked at him for a long moment, then walked over to their table. The limp was more pronounced now. He'd been on his feet for 15 hours, but somehow it looked different, not like a weakness or a failing, but like what was a mark of service, a price paid for something larger than himself. "You didn't need to know," Frank said quietly. "You just needed to remember that everyone has a story. Everyone has fought battles you can't see." The kid nodded, his face red with embarrassment and something deeper. "Yes, sir. We'll remember." Frank smiled then, a real smile, the first one most of the restaurant had ever seen from him. "See that you do." He turned back to Marines, who were still standing at attention, and his expression grew serious. "At ease, gentlemen. You're making me feel old." They laughed, but they didn't relax. Not completely. There are some people you never really stand down around, not out of fear, but out of respect. "Sir," Jim Meechin said, "would you join us at dinner? It would be an honor." Frank glanced around the restaurant, at Betty, who was nodding encouragement through her tears, at the construction workers who were raising their coffee cups in salute, at the teenagers who were still standing, still learning what respect actually looked like. "I've got tables to clear," Frank said. "Actually," Betty called out, her voice thick with emotion, "you've got the rest of the night off, with pay." Frank Martinez, who'd served his country for 26 years and served coffee for 6 more, who'd carried wounded Marines and carried plates with equal dignity, looked around Murphy's diner one more time. Then he untied his apron, hung it behind a counter, and joined his brothers for dinner. The teenagers at Table 7 left a $50 tip on a $30 check with a note that read, "For your service. Thank you, sir." Frank found it when he came in the next morning. He folded the note carefully and put it in his wallet, right next to the picture of Maria and a faded military ID card from 1968. Some battles are fought in jungles and deserts. Others are fought in diners and break rooms, in the small moments when dignity meets disrespect, when quiet service meets loud ignorance. Frank Martinez had fought both kinds and won them all the same way, with honor, with patience, and with the knowledge that true strength never needs to prove itself. The next weekend, when a new group of teenagers came in, they saw the small brass plaque Betty had installed near the coffee station. It read, "In honor of Frank Martinez, USMC, a true American hero serves here." They treated him with respect. They treated everyone with respect. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons aren't taught in classrooms or lecture halls. Sometimes they're learned in small-town diners, from quiet men with steady hands who've seen more than they'll ever tell, who've given more than they'll ever ask for in return. Frank Martinez kept waiting tables at Murphy's Diner for 3 more years. He never talked about Vietnam, never told war stories, never wore his decorations to work. But word spread quietly through the community, the way it does in small towns. The high school started bringing history classes in for field trips. Veterans groups held their monthly meetings there. Young Marines on leave would stop by just to shake his hand. And Frank served them all with the same quiet dignity. Coffee poured steady, orders taken carefully, respect given freely to anyone who walked through those doors. Because that's what heroes do. They serve, not for recognition, not for praise, but because service is who they are. It's written in their bones, carried in their hearts, and lived out in 1,000 small moments that most people never see. In Murphy's Diner, for 8 years, they saw it every day. They just didn't recognize it until someone helped them look a little closer, until they learned that sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in the most ordinary places. Staff Sergeant Frank Martinez, USMC. Waiter, hero, teacher. Same man, different uniform. Same service, different battlefield. And in the end, that made all the difference.